His was the only boat to arrive.
I think maybe it was a cow. I don't know.
There's the thank you letter from Lyndon Johnson.
There was even a monorail at one point to the east of us.
Plus, everybody forgets about pirates.
This is the coolest field trip I have ever been on.
I don't know, but I've been told T-bone dance won't ever get old.
Hello and welcome to the Long Island History Project, the podcast that brings you stories and interviews with people passionate about Long Island history. You can hear them all at longislandhistoryproject.org. My name is Chris Kretz, and I am your host. And our opening music is courtesy of the Homegrown String Band. You know, I love talking to people who have found their own particular corner of Long Island history and devoted their passion and time to it. But every once in a while, while working on the podcast, I'm pulled out of the conversation by just the hint of a voice on the wind, something calling from just over the horizon. So I'll get in the car and I'll drive east, out past the modern snack bar and the lavender farms, out to Orient Point, where I'll get on a ferry, the good one, the big one, and we'll head out into the Long Island Sound. But then the current shifts, and we'll head out to sea, and after days and nights of travel, we'll disembark on a new land, an old land, with its own languages and constellations, and yes, its own Long Island. And if we want to understand that history, if we really want to get our hands dirty and dig into it, we need to talk to today's very special guest.
So, I'm Madeleine Bessel-Koprek. I'm currently a Ph.D. student at the Australian National University studying paleoecology.
That's great. Madeleine, first of all, thank you for joining us. We're on Libsyn Connect tonight on different corners of the world. Just for your context, we talk about Long Island history, and from time to time we go looking for other Long Islands that are not connected to the East Coast of New York City. And we found you. Do you want to tell us where your Long Island is?
Yeah, of course. So our Long Island is it's a tiny little island. It's about 3 kilometres squared, and it's located in the middle of the Bass Strait, which is the body of water that connects mainland Australia and Tasmania. And it's in the eastern Bass Strait, this tiny little island off a larger island called Truewater, or Cape Barren Island.
Okay, and it's a fascinating corner of the world. I had to do some digging myself, so please feel free to correct me in any pronunciation or geographical or scientific misconceptions I may say as we're talking.
Yes, it's a little known corner of the world, yes.
For another little bit of context, I'm an academic librarian, so I'm used to working with different disciplines. But I've never spoken or talked with a paleoecologist or someone studying that. Can you give us a definition of that?
Yeah, so paleoecology, I guess, if you break the word up, you can kind of make sense of it. Paleo being old and ecology being the study of landscapes. So what we do as paleoecologists is look at really how landscapes have changed over time and how vegetation histories and fire histories and human histories all interact.
And how did you find yourself getting into that field?
Yeah, it's this random thing, and actually I hadn't heard of paleoecology about 2 years ago, but I was doing my undergraduate degree, doing a Bachelor of Science, majoring in environmental science and climate science. And I did this course on paleoecology, and it was just awesome. Like, I immediately fell in love with it. It's a real area in which you really mix environmental science and climate science. And it was such a fun course. We did such fun field work. You're often like waist deep in mud, taking sediment cores. And it was immediately interesting to me.
Yeah, and we'll talk about mud cores because it's an interesting aspect. So the research we're talking about was recently published, reconstructing the long-term ecological history of Long Island.
Yes, that's right.
I've read it and understood it to the extent that I can. But so you were on site. Do you want to just give us paint a picture for us of what that Long Island looks like, what it looks like when you're there?
Yeah, sure. I guess the most important thing about Long Island is how remote it feels. It kind of feels like you're on the edge of the world. Getting there is quite an ordeal. You go in a little plane, which is very exciting, and then a little boat, and then to get to some of our coring sites, we took a little tractor ride and then walked. So you kind of can't emphasize enough how remote this place feels. And another key aspect of the Bass Strait, which anyone who's been to the Bass Strait or lives on the island there will tell you, is that it's extremely windy. There's just these strong westerly winds almost constantly, and that just adds to the feeling of remoteness and wildness. But it's an incredibly beautiful place. The ocean is all around you, and these incredible grasslands, granite rock structures, some interesting little forests on pockets of the island. And yeah, it's just an amazing place.
Two questions. One, anything about the wildlife you saw either flying through or migrating through, and then I can imagine the night sky there must be amazing.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I guess your first question, in terms of animals, on Long Island, there's mostly the most animals you're looking at is bird life, and there's an incredible range of bird life. There's the Cape Barren geese, which are really big geese. They're quite nice. They just waddle around. We saw some nesting black swans, which are beautiful. They're the Australian big black swans, which are beautiful. And then obviously there's a huge amount of migratory birds as well. One of the common species in the area is the mutton bird, which I think the scientific thing is the short-tailed shearweaver. They're called the mutton birds. And they live on the tussocks of the islands in little burrows. And they're a really important cultural bird for Indigenous people, as mutton birding season's a big thing on the islands. I don't know if we saw any mutton birds, it wasn't the right time, but you can see their little burrows all over the island, which is very neat. And then the night sky, it's amazing. It really is amazing. There's no light pollution anywhere, and all you are is surrounded by ocean. And it's quite a wild ocean, so you feel very much on the edge of the world.
And for modern day, like right now, how inhabited is it or isn't it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's got there's a grazing lease on the island owned by a family, but no one permanently lives on the island currently.
Is it true there's only been 3 owners, or I guess 3, modern or colonial, however you want to paint it? But
yes, that's right. Yeah, 3 recorded owners. So it's very interesting when you're there. There's a slightly more modern house that the owner stays in when he's there, but there's also the old house which dates back a few, to the 1800s, which is quite old by Australian standards. And that's where we as the research team, there were 3 of us, were staying. And that was quite the experience. It was like staying in a museum. It was amazing. Felt like we were some of the early sealers staying on the island.
yeah, right. So just to fill in some of my gaps in terms of the history of that area. So in terms of the relationship between Tasmania and Australia and where this group of islands sort of came into the picture was early 1800s, and it was British kind of discovering a colony of seals there, and that kind of drew their attention.
Yeah. So I guess if you don't mind, I'll go back a little bit further.
Sure. Yep.
Which is when the area was occupied by Indigenous people. So that was during the last glacial maximum, when sea levels were lower. So about, the peak was around 20,000 years ago. There was actually a land bridge connecting mainland Australia to Tasmania. And so what now are the Bass Strait Islands were actually high plateaus on this land bridge. And they're very important to Indigenous people. There was occupation, use of resources around there. But then as sea levels rose and ice melted, the islands became isolated, and eventually Indigenous people left. And then they were unoccupied for a few thousand years. And then eventually, European occupation started.
So we're in the Bass Strait, and it's a grouping of islands. Is it Furneaux? Is that the right?
Yes. Yeah, called the Furneaux Group. Yes, Furneaux Group.
Okay, so there's about 100 or so. What level of study had been going on there previously in terms of their history or ecology? Was it a site for any particular study?
There's been a few studies. It's not very well studied as a region, which is why now we're starting to study it, because it is a very important ecological, geographical, and also cultural region. There's been a few paleoecological studies that were conducted by my supervisor, Simon Haberle, and other paleoecologists on some of the islands of the Furneaux Group, including Clark Island, Cape Barren Island, and Flinders Island. And Flinders Island is the main kind of habitation centre of the Furneaux Group. That's where there's farms, there's a few towns where most people in the Furneaux Group live. True one at Cape Barren Island is Aboriginal land, so it's a very important cultural place. And studies there have really been looking at how Indigenous fire regimes have worked over a long time scale, but also kind of looking at the ecological histories of these places as well. But really, we're still in the early days of exploring these islands paleoecologically.
And I would imagine the remoteness helps preserve at least some of the evidence, or you can find things that you won't find in a more built-up environment.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. The main thing we need for paleoecological research is bodies of water that haven't really been drained or tampered with. So by nature, we're often going to places that are really a bit remote or really beautiful and pristine, which is kind of one of the nice sides of the job.
And gets us into the mud a little bit. So you were trying to reconstruct
Yes,
the history. So I love the different corroborating or the different things that you use as evidence. So do you want to walk through, I'm thinking of, the structure of the article, but if you want to walk through what pieces of evidence did you piece together to kind of map out the history of this island?
Yeah, of course. So in paleoecology in general and in the Long Island study we did, there's kind of two main proxies that we take from sediment cores, which tell us a lot about past environmental histories. And so the first and the biggest one is the pollen record. And pollen's this absolutely amazing thing. We often don't think about it apart from just, dust that makes us sneeze. But each plant, each type of plant actually produces pollen that physically looks different from other plants. And pollen grains are extremely tough. They have this strong outer wall called sporopollenin, which means that they just survive in a sediment record for a long, long, long time. And so what happens is when plants produce pollen, they get blown by wind across the surface of a landscape, and some of them will eventually settle on the surface of lagoons and then sink to the bottom. And over time, we get layers and layers building up of different pollen types. And then so what we do as paleoecologists is come along and take a sediment core that digs down into that sediment. And then by looking at each individual layer and extracting pollen grains from each layer, we can actually tell what vegetation was there at what time, which is so neat, I think.
Yeah. So I'm familiar with ice cores, but so how do you physically get the mud core out and then keep it intact enough that you could actually look at it layer by layer?
We use this thing, it's called a dissection corer, but it's pretty much like a metal tube you can kind of imagine that we push into, and they're often soft sediments at the bottom of lakes and lagoons. So we push this kind of metal cylinder in and out comes a core, like a kind of long, thin stretch of mud you can kind of imagine. And it kind of maintains that long shape, and we wrap it up and keep it in a kind of cradle and then transport it back to a lab so that it's still in its original kind of laying out. And then it means that the top of the core is the modern stuff. And the further down you go, the older it is, and things are preserved within those layers. But that's why it's quite important to find a site that hasn't been disturbed. You can imagine if cattle have been walking through the area, it will all be, all those layers will be disturbed, and it'll be so hard to tell what's the older and what's the newer.
Sure. And you were talking about the pollen, and it was fascinating to see that there are certain types of pollen that came over with the British settlers, like that. So it was a pollen from a plant that wasn't there.
That's right. Yeah. So we often see in Australia pine pollen. We don't have native pines. So when we see the pinus pollen, we know that that's a really clear marker of when Europeans arrived. And the other thing is often, European people would arrive in the landscape, and one of the first things they do actually is plant trees that remind them of home. So quite soon in the record after that arrival, we start to see the pine trees. And pine pollen is it's a huge pollen grain. It's really identifiable. So as soon as you look down the microscope, you're like, yep, Europeans. So that's a really nice marker.
And so what other markers or pools of evidence did you draw from?
Yeah, other kind of proxies we use, the main one is what was similar to pollen, and to many people kind of the exact same as pollen, but to us very different, is the non-pollen palindromorphs. So they're just other little things. They look a bit similar to pollen, but they can tell us a lot about, for example, the water quality of the site and water depth. And that can start to give us a bit of indication of what, climate was doing at that time, what sea level was doing, and then further indication of what plants were doing. So one that I thought was really cool is a non-pollen palindromorph called podospora, which is actually associated with the poo of large grazing animals. So in the Australian context, we do have grazing animals like kangaroos, but they don't really have this podospora associated with them. So when we see the podospora, we are immediately thinking of cattle, sheep, which again aren't native here, so that's a clear sign of colonisation. It aligned in our study really neatly with the pinus, which again lined up neatly with our radiocarbon dates, which all started to give us a pretty confident idea that the timeframes we were looking at were all lining up and that our records were pretty solid. The other proxy that we really look at is charcoal grains, which is, as you can imagine, just tiny little bits of charcoal in the record that tell us what the fire regime was doing in history. And that's a really important part of the story, looking at how fire and vegetation were interacting over these past 1,000 years.
So how much of the field, or tell me which you like better, because it sounds like there's a lot of field work, but then a lot of intensive lab work. And is it sort of 50-50, or do you gravitate to one or the other, or can you send it to the lab and go over the results?
Oh, yeah, no, the fieldwork's definitely the fun bit, but that takes up a tiny bit of the time, and then it's the laborious lab work. I think for a lot of us, the fieldwork's why we do it. You see these amazing sites, but the lab work's fun too, and that's where you start to, it feels almost like detective work. You're kind of, literally meticulously looking at these tiny little details and starting to build up this big picture of what the landscape looked like. So it can be tedious, but can also be really quite exciting as you start to, in your mind, you're looking at these pollen grains, you're looking at the charcoal, and in your head you can start to see what the landscape would have looked like 500 years ago, 600 years ago, 1,000 years ago, and that's really quite cool.
Yeah, so speak a little to, I don't know, what if you had an assumption of what you were going to find in the landscape and then what you actually did find, some of the results that you found.
Yeah, so I guess in the Australian context, what we often see is a slightly more vegetated in terms of trees and shrubs in the landscape prior to colonisation. And in areas where Indigenous people had been living up to the point of colonisation, we often see that there has been a fire regime that manages these vegetation types, but that there are trees and shrubs and a mixture of vegetations. And then what we see is the point of colonisation is often accompanied by a massive spike in the charcoal and a clearing of the land for grazing and pastures and farms and everything. And then in the pollen record after that point, we often see more grass species and less tree and shrub species. So I guess as a rough assumption, that's kind of what we thought we'd see on Long Island, following that traditional kind of pattern, but maybe without the Indigenous fire management, obviously for the period where Indigenous people weren't there. But what we actually found was something a little bit different. Actually, I'll go back one step. And the other thing we had from Long Island that was quite interesting is a couple of historical accounts from the early colonisation period that described the island as being heavily treed. So that kind of fitted with the assumption we had that, yeah, trees were in the past. What we're seeing now is open grassy landscapes. So we kind of assumed that, yeah, there was this massive clearing at the point of colonisation and a dramatically altered vegetation regime from what was there prior to colonisation. But doing our paleoecological analysis, what we actually found is that the grasslands that dominate most of the island today were actually there for at least 1,000 years, which is well before the point of colonisation. So what that actually means is what we assumed is a modern ecosystem is actually quite an old ecosystem. In fact, we did some statistical analysis that shows that these are possibly kind of a refugia from the last glacial maximum dating back 20,000 years ago. And it's kind of indicative of what the whole region would have looked like. So actually, this is a really important ecosystem to conserve. It's not just something modern that's the result of a really altered ecosystem, but a deep and lasting ecosystem that's really important.
That's fascinating. And just in terms of the importance of that land bridge and migration patterns, does that factor into the importance of this grouping of islands and like what would you hope or think it could tell you?
Yeah, exactly. So the land bridge was really important for migration, not only of people from mainland Australia into Tasmania, but also, as you can imagine, of species. So animal species, but also some plant species kind of get transported across that land bridge. And the vegetation at the time, obviously most of it has changed, it's gone under the water. But what we're seeing on these islands, which kind of act as the high points, they were the high points of the land bridge, a kind of can be tiny remnants of what was this really ancient kind of vegetation, which I think was the main point of our study really, is kind of challenging this assumption that we often have that, or at least I'm not so sure about in America, but in Australia, we often think that grasslands are not important ecologically or conservationally because we often associate them with pastures or as having no trees. And then you kind of assume that the trees have been removed and therefore the grass is just kind of the absence of the important stuff. But actually these grasslands in and of themselves are really important ecosystems. They can be really enduring ecosystems, long-lasting ecosystems, natural ecosystems. So I guess that was actually quite a neat little point that our study found.
And what would you still hope to find? Like what questions are still in your mind about the ecosystem or the paleoecology of Long Island?
Well, I guess, as we talked about a little bit earlier, there are 100 islands in the Furneaux Group. So what would actually be quite interesting is to do more paleoecological studies on some of the other islands around that haven't even been looked at yet. And it'd be interesting to see if we're seeing similar patterns of this kind of grassland, or if we're actually seeing more vegetated ecosystems on other islands. And then Long Island is a bit more of a unique little patch, and it'd be interesting to look at why that is. And obviously this, in paleoecology, this record that we were looking at of 1,000 years is really, really short. So it would always be neat, probably not from Long Island, but from other islands around, to be getting these longer term histories of kind of, 40,000 years, and then be looking at these ecosystems on much longer timescales and trying to understand them in a much broader context.
Could you say more, or what would you want to tell maybe a United States audience about the indigenous landscape there and maybe the importance, or as I understand it, is the island somewhat jointly administered by either a preserver, indigenous trust or something?
Long Island is not under indigenous management, it's privately owned. So there's a grazing lease, it's owned by a family, not indigenous land. Next to Long Island is Cape Barren Island, which is called Truana in the Palawa language, which is the reclaimed language of the Tasmanian Aboriginal people. And Truana is Aboriginal land. It's a really, really important place. It's a really, really beautiful place. Like Long Island is beautiful, but Cape Barren, Truana is quite stunning. And that's a really important place culturally. And so this wasn't the Long Island study we looked at, but other studies kind of done in the area of Truana have been looking at that long-term Indigenous history, especially the use of cultural burning on the island to manage vegetation, which is really interesting. And what we're seeing is that Indigenous people for long, long periods of time were employing burning to manage their landscapes and also adapting to changes and adapting fire regimes appropriately. So that's really fascinating.
Yeah, and I'm in no way an expert, but I've heard similar practices at least in the East Coast woodlands Indians, that they would do controlled burns to manage. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm always curious. So I'm talking to you from the South Shore of Long Island, New York.
Yep.
When I say that, does that bring up any mental image, or do you know anything about Long Island, New York, or have any connections to it? Or
I've never been to your Long Island. I think it might be a slightly different vibe. I've heard of, is it Long Island iced tea? Is that a thing?
It's a drink, yeah.
But you've got more like cities. You've got big, beautiful beaches, I believe, on some parts of Long Island, isn't there?
Yes. Yep. We're known for that.
Yeah. So I can kind of picture a dune with a little bit of grass. I'm not sure if that's accurate. I must have seen a TV show or something.
It's interesting. There's an ecological feature. It's called the Hempstead Plains, which at one point stretched across miles and miles of Long Island, and it was, people would remark about it. It was used for grazing. So when you're talking about grasslands, it was similar to that. And there's groups that are trying to preserve. There's little pockets of it still existing, and they've kind of adopted them and trying to maintain the indigenous grasses. And so it's a common spirit, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So anything else about, first of all, how are you doing with the Ph.D.? Is that, what level are you at?
Yeah, thanks. I just started my PhD this year, and I've just jumped across to the other side of the Bass Strait. And this time I'm looking at King Island, it's called, which is comparatively, it's a lot bigger than Long Island. But doing similar kind of work, but looking more at that long history, hoping to go back kind of 40,000 years, and obviously a bit more of an in-depth kind of study of that island over there.
Okay, so there's plenty of work for you to do, it sounds like.
That's right. Lots of mud to dig.
Yeah. And anything else about the study or the field work, or just anything about the area that you want to get across that I didn't ask you?
Well, I'm trying to have a little think. I guess one of the other things that we did in this study that was actually two things I guess I could comment. The first one was how we collected what we're calling moss posters from the present day vegetation on the island. And I think, I'm trying to remember the exact number, I think we had 7 different communities. So for example, like a melaleuca forest, a grassland, a fern field, and we collected little pockets of moss from each of those ecosystems. And moss acts as a natural pollen trap. So what we were able to do is rinse the pollen from that moss, look at it under the microscope, and that gave ourselves a really nice modern analogue to compare to what we were looking at down the sediment core for the historical vegetation of the island. So that, that meant that we could be pretty confident that we weren't seeing forests because we know what the pollen assemblage looked like on the forest today, and we weren't seeing that in the historical record. And then the other thing, which we did a bit in this study and we do some more in other studies, is look at aerial photographs of the region and physically map how vegetation's changed for that period that aerial photographs exist. So I think for Long Island, we had photographs dating back to 1974, which is a little bit of our period, a little bit of our records. So that gives us a little bit of grounding as well to see how the modern vegetation has shifted. And I guess paleoecology is about just using these different methods of analysis together to start to build up a picture of what vegetation's been doing over long periods of time.
And just one thought on the aerial photography, because you go into in the article a lot about the digital work you had to do or that you did to get data. So vegetation to me, in my silly thought, it's got, you have to see the color, but these were not color photographs, but then you were able to still study density and take the variations of the shadings and.
Yeah. So it's quite complicated, and I have to confess, I'm actually not a GIS expert, and most of that analysis was done by Stefania Ondei from the University of Tasmania. And she was very clever at extracting those almost pixel by pixel by different definitions of color and grading, and then code them into what vegetation class that meant, and then for each photograph kind of compare coverage of different vegetation classes over time. And that's a really valuable tool that we can use in conjunction with our pollen and charcoal analysis to see how vegetation's shifted, which is quite neat.
So I have a final question. Do you think there's more interest in this type of work in Australia, given the landscape that you're surrounded by, or is it just the people that would find it anyway?
I think that because, we talk to people when we go out to do this kind of research. We talk to landowners, we talk to communities, we try to often engage with local schools as well to get them on board with what we're doing. I find that people are really interested in it. I think it's something that people can understand and relate to quite easily. Like once you get your head around what a sediment core is and that you can take pollen out and look at it, and once you see pictures of pollen grains, they're actually quite beautiful. And then when you can take that back and think, oh, what would my local park have looked like? What would my local, region have looked like? I think people find that really fascinating. Definitely with Indigenous communities we've worked with, there's a lot of engagement. And often we're working alongside communities and they're helping us, they're guiding us, they're telling us what they already know. And often our data is only supporting what they already know. But it's good to have the scientific backing for that as well. So I think there's a lot of support and engagement there too. I think, paleoecology is probably not the most known discipline out there, but I think once you start to think about it, once you engage with it, once you see some of the stories coming out, it's really, really engaging. So, and in Australia, which I'm sure is like America, we've got so many different ecosystems in the way that they've interacted over time, and the Australian context and the American context too, bushfires, bushfire events, fire regimes, how that's interacted with vegetation is something that's on a lot of people's minds quite regularly. So to be able to see that in history and kind of look at how fire management was used in the past and how we could kind of use that to mitigate these big fire events is something that a lot of people are really excited about.
Yeah, very relevant too. Yeah. Well, hopefully in some small way we can spark a fire in someone listening to this who might enjoy going into the mud.
Yeah, exactly. Someone will come and join the paleoecology world.
Thank you, Madeleine. And for those listening, yes, I believe that was our first international interview. I thank her for spending time with us and presenting that whole history. We wish her luck on her Ph.D. and we'll look with great interest on her future publications, Unraveling That Corner of the World. We will have links in our show notes, and do check them out to more information. If you're like me and had really not much knowledge on the history of Tasmania and Australia, definitely check it out. We'll have links to her sites, her research, also a great documentary on the land bridge. Those will be listed at longislandhistoryproject.org. And if you have your own story to tell, if you've been doing your own research, whatever level, whatever aspect of our Long Island or your Long Island, reach out. We'd love to talk to you. You can get in touch at longislandhistoryproject@gmail.com. Coming soon, we will be continuing our tour of Long Island oral history projects. myself and Rob Annan from Long Island Library Resources Council. So stay tuned for another one of those. And we will also have a special Father's Day edition coming up soon. Our outro music is Capering by the Blue Dot Sessions, used under an Attribution 4.0 international license. That does it for this episode, but as always, thank you for listening.